Hi! In this video I'm going to be talking you through how I made this fake prop sandwich out of a piece of XPS foam and a few other basic materials. So let's start. I bought this 24-inch square by 1-inch thick project panel of pink XPS foam from my local Home Depot. These project panels are a really nice size to work with in my small studio compared to those 8-foot by 4-foot sheets that you can get. This prop had to be less than 4 inches tall, so I started by cutting out a rectangle measuring 3.5 inches by 3 3/8 of an inch, just using my trusty Olfa knife and a steel ruler. I roughly marked out the centre line around the edge to create the division line for the two pieces of bread. At this stage I was still figuring out how best to go about shaping the bread. I initially intended to keep the foam in one piece and just stuff the fake fillings in around the edges, but as I carved I realised it would actually be much more streamlined to cut the foam into two pieces of bread to work on shaping them separately. I'll get to that later. I started to create the rough bread shape by softening the edges with the knife, just gently carving away slowly at this stage as I keep turning the piece and seeing how it looks, making sure I don't get too carried away and carve away too much material, and referring to reference images online of real sandwiches just to keep me heading in the direction of sandwich rather than strange pink block. Before I decided to cut the block in half to work on each slice of bread separately, I scrunched up a ball of foil and experimented with creating a bread-like texture on the surface. This really helped me see that I was getting somewhere and that I could make this look like a convincing piece of bread with a bit more refining. Now on to cutting the foam in half. I have a fine-tooth saw that would have sliced this thing in half beautifully, but it also would have made a lot more mess, so I struggled a bit with the knife and eventually managed to split it in two. I should probably treat myself to a hot wire cutter for future projects. Cutting out a more bread-like shape, I could really start to see where this was going. I couldn't wait to get to painting, but first I had to mark out the line where fluffy bread meets crust. I just went straight in with a pencil. It didn't have to be too neat, as real bread is soft and squishy. I went back over the markings, pushing harder with the pencil to emphasise the dividing line between textured bread and smoother crust. On to painting. Starting with the bready part, I mixed white acrylic paint with yellow ochre, plus a small amount of burnt sienna and just a squidge of burnt umber. It's especially important while mixing colours to refer to images of the real thing that you're trying to imitate. If I'd had some real white bread at hand, it would have been even better, but I didn't, so some pictures on Google did the trick. For the crust colour, I mixed some more yellow ochre with some more burnt sienna, a bit of white, a bit of burnt umber and a touch of black. After painting the crust, I cleaned up the edges of the fluffy bread bit and called one piece of bread done. Before making the second slice of bread, I wanted to get the ball rolling with the fillings. I thought the green tissue paper would work quite well for the lettuce. Obviously, by its very nature, tissue paper is super thin, so I doubled some up, covering one side in white PVA glue, spreading the glue with a damp paintbrush, then squeezing the two sides together. As a kid I had this life-size set of fake burgers and hot dogs, and I loved it. It was so fun. What is it about fake food? Anyway, the cheese was a piece of silicone rubber that looked so effective as cheese, and the lettuce was also made of a rubbery plastic that looked really legit. At this small scale though, and under the tight time constraints of this project, I didn't have the opportunity to get complicated and start playing with sculpting, moulding and casting a couple of pieces of lettuce that, in the end, would only be seen poking out the edges of this sandwich. Realism also wasn't super high on the agenda. Just looking good and being completed in time for the event was highest priority. As a recovering perfectionist, that's something I had to keep reminding myself throughout this project. This thing I'm doing with the foil is one of those instances where I was overcomplicating matters. I was trying to sort of over-engineer some folds and texture in the tissue paper, and as it turns out, I ended up just making 2 more pieces of lettuce and just scrunching them up. I made a couple more pieces, and in one of them I sandwiched a piece of darker green tissue paper, just to give a bit of tone variation in the lettuce leaves. Instead of messing around with the foil texture thing for these 2 pieces, I just covered them in a wash of PVA white glue and water and scrunched them up and left them on a piece of foil to dry. Next up, tomatoes. I grabbed a piece of white foam board and sketched out some sliced tomato pieces. I cut them out with a knife and then peeled off the paper layer from the foam. You could also use the pink foam for this, but the 4mm thick white foam board was closer to the correct thickness for sliced tomatoes, so I went with that. I found some images of some juicy sliced tomatoes, roughly sketched out the design, then began carving the depth and details into the foam. Repeat times 3, then on to painting. For the tomato colours, I mixed transparent vermilion, primary magenta, a little bit of primary yellow and a touch of white. I started with the darker, more reddish tones around the outside edges and worked my way into the middle, getting lighter and more orangey towards the centre. Paint really helped bring these little tomatoes to life. And once the acrylic paint was dry, I gave them a coat of Duraclear gloss varnish to bring out that juicy tomato shine. Back to the lettuce now that they've had time to dry. I cut away the sharp straight edges to make them a bit more leaf shaped. Then scrunched, scrunched, scrunched. Yikes, try saying that 3 times in a row. Moving on to the mustard now. I used this modelling paste medium that's designed to thicken paint into more of a paste consistency. I mixed it with yellow ochre and a dash of white acrylic paint. And once I was happy that the colour was suitably mustardy, I spread it on the 1 slice of bread that I'd already made, making sure to spill some over the edges so that it looks like mustard is squeezing out of the sandwich once it all comes together. And once that was dry, I varnished it to give it that fresh mustard shine. And I decided that the lettuce leaves looked a bit matte as well, so I gave them the same treatment with the varnish, just to make them look a bit more alive. Now onto our 4th and final filling, the ham. I didn't have a suitable ham colour in my Fimo stash, so I used these 4 colours to mix one. Predominantly the white and pink, but the grey and yellow helped to tone down that quite vivid pink. I didn't need a huge piece, as this was just going to be little pieces sticking out the edge of the sandwich, so I cut it into some smaller pieces and played around seeing how it looked on the other side of the bread and making sure I had enough to go around. I was quite happy with how it was looking, but the pieces were looking a bit too smooth, so I used a bit of foil to just add a small amount of texture. I didn't want the pieces to be flat as ham is floppy, so I made some little foil props to rest the pieces on so that they'd retain their shape when I baked them in the oven. Now, fresh out the oven, I just wanted to look again at positioning, where these pieces of ham would look best once the sandwich is whole. I thought they looked a bit too uniform, so I mixed up some pale pink paint and brushed some loose details on the pieces, then smudged it into the texture and patted some of the paint away with some paper towel, just to create some subtle variations and break up the base colour. With the fillings pretty much done, it was time to make the second piece of bread. I used the finished piece of bread as a template to sketch out the shape on the other piece of foam. Then I got to work carving and shaping the second slice of bread. After blocking out the main shape and before moving on to the finer details, I compared it to the finished slice to make sure the size and scale and shape were looking good. Then it was on to creating the texture, painting, and finally I had 2 slices of bread. Acrylic paint can dry with a bit of a shine, so for the bread, to protect them as well as dull the shine, I gave them both a coat of matte Mod Podge. Back in the cold cuts department, the ham was looking too matte, so I gave it a coat of gloss varnish to help it look less dry. Now it was time to figure out the final arrangement of all the fillings. This took a surprisingly long time. Having spent all this time making all the pieces, I didn't want to mess it up at the last hurdle. I wanted to give all the fillings a chance to be seen, while also making the tastiest looking sandwich that I could. Once it was stuck together, there would be no more rearranging lettuce. This prop was to be displayed standing upright, propped up on a rod, so I carved a channel and placed a small piece of tube that would then slot onto the stand. Now on to gluing in all the fillings. Certain glues and foam don't get along very well, so I opted for my relatively cool melt glue gun. And for the bits closer to the edges, I used Aleene's tacky glue, which is a lot easier to control and dries more cleanly. Finally, it was time to glue the 2 halves together, and we have a sandwich.